So believe it or not, I was actually here both before Paul Valler and Dave Barnes. So I'm ancient completely in this school. The first time I sat in this chapel, or the first memory I have of sitting in this chapel, was in first form, right at the front here, and a boy called Fraser Fife was standing up giving one of the lessons, and his kilt fell off. So I've always had very fond memories of being in here. It's a place where I played a lot of jokes, talked a lot, and probably did things that I'm not ever going to confess to Paul or Dave on this. Thank you very much for welcoming me here during what is an absolutely awful time in Europe and for the world. I'm aware that there are some people in here whose families might be involved, and I'm happy to talk afterwards with you about what we're doing to help people in Ukraine right now and what we might be able to do to support your families. When I left Strath, I went to the London School of Economics, where I studied Soviet history and economics, and then from there I went to Sandhurst and joined the army, where I served in a number of different conflict zones before leaving about 10 years ago. And I transitioned through a number of different jobs until I got to Ukraine, where I was seconded by the Foreign Office to the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, and I was the head of operations in Donbass, in rebel-held territory in Luhansk. And our job there was to stop this war from happening. So we failed. Absolutely, completely, utterly failed. And what I want to do tonight is just give you a little bit of a background as to where we are, why did this happen, a little bit of more recent history, talk a little bit about currently what is happening, and then I'm going to take questions at any stage. I want this to be a conversation, not a lecture, okay? So don't be shy, stick your hands up, ask any questions you want. There are no stupid questions at all. So a conversation about what's happening in Ukraine. And in the second part, I'm going to introduce you to some of my friends who are currently on the run with their families or are suffering, okay? So where have I been in Ukraine? I lived in Lugansk or Luhansk, depending on which language you want to speak, for almost 4.5 years. I worked in Severodonetsk, I worked in Odessa, I worked in Dnipro, I worked in Poltava and Kharkiv and in Kiev. And for the last 2 years, I've been in Lviv, where I've had a really wonderful time. So my breadth of what's happening in Ukraine at the moment comes from that perspective of living across it for the last 7 years. Why are we here? What is going on, and what is Mr. Putin doing, and why? So we have to reach back in history, and one of the things you need to consider about the way that people think and the way that history is viewed, either in Russia or in the West, is very different. We have a cycle of 4 or 5 years of elections, of things that we go to. We have harvest cycles, which are natural rhythms. We have election cycles. And Russia is a much bigger place, a much grander vision, a huge vista, steps, okay, and scale that people who have never been out of Britain can hardly imagine. When I tell people that I drive past sunflower fields in eastern Ukraine and it takes me 12 minutes to drive past one field, it's really hard for people to grasp. It is huge, and concepts of time are very different. What we think we'll achieve in 5 years, great Russian leaders will think of in 50 years' time. Okay? They don't care about their reputation now. They don't care what you're going to think about them next year. What they're caring about is what's going to happen in 50 years' time, 100 years' time, or how they're going to be remembered in history. At the same time, they look backwards. We do as well. We think of, 1939, Dunkirk, and 1940, Battle of Britain as being our finest hour, okay, almost 80 years ago. And Russia looks further back, way, way back, to Peter the Great, Ivan the Terrible, Catherine the Great, and considers itself as this great player in global history throughout those centuries. And as a result, it maintains the score, it keeps the score. When was the last time the United Kingdom went to war with Russia? How long ago? Crimea, 1854-ish. And at that time, we didn't just fight in Crimea. We actually bombed Helsinki, which is the capital of Finland, but at the time was part of Russia. And we also bombed Vladivostok on the other side. So a proper world war, which we took part in. So there's a grand scale that I want you to keep in mind of time, of history, of grievances, and the things that Russia is worried about. Okay, so one of the things that has saved Russia when it was invaded by Napoleon and when it was invaded by Hitler is its space. The fact is, nobody has successfully conquered Russia because there's too much space. There are too many people, and as you go into the Russian landscape, you start to get eaten up and gobbled up by the space. And it's impossible for people to actually imagine that. So when we got to the end of the Cold War, and the Soviet Union, or the Russian Empire, for want of a better word, we can swap those two terms quite often. All of those states around the edge of Russia, which had bought space and time to defend itself, started to go into NATO. Now, NATO was formed to counter the Warsaw Pact at the beginning of the Cold War. And NATO is a defensive, economic, political alliance. But Russia does not see that. Russia sees that as a threat. And more importantly, it sees NATO on the edge of its boundaries as a threat. Okay? Because we're much closer. States such as Estonia, Lithuania, Latvia are all NATO countries now. Okay? Then other states were aspiring to join NATO. Georgia, Moldova, all part of the Russian sphere of influence or the former Soviet Union. And as a result, Russia pushed back. And Russia, back in 2012, began to argue that there had been a gentlemanly agreement at the end of the Cold War that NATO was not going to expand. Well, it wasn't written down anywhere at all. It's quite possible that somebody once said to Boris Yeltsin that we might not do that, and Boris was probably too drunk to remember what was actually said, but that was the case. We potentially did say that we weren't going to expand. And our expansion into Russia's space and territory creates a risk and a threat that a Russian leader who was brought up in the history of the Soviet Union and brought up in the greatness of the Russian Empire cannot and will not accept in the shadow of his family's experiences during the Second World War. So psychologically, NATO is pushing on the boundaries of Russia. It's not actually true. We would quite like to have Russia in as well. I worked for NATO as a political advisor several years ago, working on what we called emerging security challenges, trying to predict what's going to happen in the next 10 years. And Russia at that time was part of the discussion. But somehow we diverged. And we diverged on a number of different things. It's never one thing, is it? It's Syria, it's Georgia, it's Iraq, it's Yemen, it's policies in Africa, it's climate change. And climate change has a role to play here, as does food security. Okay, and we'll come on to that in a moment. Is everyone still with me? Cool. So we reached a point where Russia is paranoid about what's happening on its borders. And Ukraine in 1991, correct me any Ukrainians here, was it 90 or 91, I can't remember, got their independence, okay? And they got their independence from the Soviet Union, and in return they had to surrender their nuclear weapons, okay? And this was the Budapest Memorandum, which some of you may have seen in the news recently. So Ukraine starts off on a track of independence, and it has a series of revolutions and crises, economic crisis, corruption crisis, political crisis. You may remember the Orange Revolution, you may not, and a whole host of names that come and go as leaders. And it doesn't really seem to get anywhere, whilst at the same time Russia is booming and flourishing with all of its natural resources. And as a result, Ukraine starts to look towards the West for help and support. And the country, also quite large, is split east and west along the way that it either speaks, whether it's a Russian language in the east and to the north, and Ukrainian, Hungarian, Romanian, and Greek in various parts of the country as well. So it's not a homogeneous country, but they were looking towards the west. And so they began the preparations to join NATO and began to aspire to the European Union. And in 2014, Ukraine was just about to sign the accession agreement to join the European Union when the president, Yanukovych, did a volte-face and then switched back towards the Russian sphere of influence. And that led to the Maidan Protests. Is there anybody here who has not heard of the Maidan Protests? Okay, so Netflix. Who's heard of Netflix? Good. Watch Winter on Fire. Okay, that'll tell you all about the Maidan protests. And this was the population of Ukraine rising up and saying, hang on a minute, we were heading west towards Europe, and you've just turned us around and headed us back in history, back towards the east, away from democracy, away from liberalism, and we're not happy about it. And 100 people were shot dead by the special forces on the streets after weeks of rioting. And that led to the overthrow of President Yanukovych, and then three regions within Ukraine declared independence. The first one is Lviv. It's a surprise to many. Not many people know that. But for 4 days, Lviv Oblast region had its own People's Republic, where they burned all the criminal records of everybody that was in the police stations, and then had declared themselves independent from Ukraine, wanting to join Europe because the rest of Ukraine was too slow. And then shortly afterwards, we had the invasion of Crimea, or the annexation of Crimea, and then the declaration of independence by Luhansk and Donetsk, which are in the heartland of industrial Soviet Union. Okay? I'll give you an example of what those places are like. I talked about 12 minutes of driving past a sunflower field. It's gorgeous, full of natural resources, beautifully wealthy, and some of the poorest people I've met in the world. In villages that are falling down, they don't have running water, they're fed by wells, there's no reliable electricity or gas, but yet they are surrounded by coal, by gas, by sunflower fields. 75% of the world's sunflower oil comes from Ukraine. And that's important. We'll come back to that in a moment. Okay? So Luhansk and Donetsk declared independence, and the emergency government in Kiev overreacted and sent troops very heavy-handedly, and then this resulted in the armed conflict, and Russia saw an opportunity, took the opportunity, and occupied those territories. That was 2014. And that's when the war began. The war didn't begin 2 weeks ago. The war's been going on for 7 years. I've been part of that war for the last 7 years, in which over 30,000 Ukrainians have been killed, men, women, children, soldiers, and an unknown number of separatists or Russians or rebels have been killed on the other side as well. And in that time, the political scene in Ukraine continues to be interesting and charged. Ukraine did not have the resources to fight back and take those territories back. And there was a number of agreements that were reached called the Minsk Agreements, which were negotiated every 2 weeks in Belarus, and which was my job to make sure that these were being implemented in the east. And they weren't. We talk about a ceasefire. There never was a ceasefire in eastern Ukraine. There was a shot fired at least once every day. There were so-called ceasefires, and we were able to negotiate local ceasefires to help repair electricity, gas, water, get sick people across the front line, rescue people trapped in minefields, all that sort of stuff. But there has not been a ceasefire, and there has not been peace in Ukraine for the last 7 years. As part of the Minsk Agreements, there was meant to be a discussion about political reform and constitutional reform in Ukraine. And the Russians have been saying this has to happen first before peace happens. And Ukraine has been saying peace has to happen first before we discuss constitutional reform and the borders. So it was inevitable that the war was going to expand, because the Russians were not going to get their way, and Ukraine was not able to end the war militarily. So you've seen for the last 3 months the tension beginning to get ratcheted up and up and up, until what we had 14, is it day 14 or day 15? Day 15. A massive air, land and sea invasion of the sovereign territory of Ukraine from Belarus and the Russian Federation. And that fighting is desperate and is going on now. We did not expect that. To be honest, in our organization, we expected that he was going to invade Donbass and take Luhansk and Donetsk completely, and that he would put pressure everywhere else. We did not expect what happened. I don't think anybody expected that. Because had Mr. Putin not invaded and had sat on the edges, he would have achieved all of his geostrategic objectives as we understood them. He had divided Europe from the United States and the UK, because the US and the UK were saying there's going to be an invasion. France and Germany were saying, it's all going to be cool. And the rest of Europe was, left and right on that side. Why are France and Germany cool with what Russia's been doing? 7 years ago, France and Germany were criticizing NATO because of the war in Ukraine. And these are NATO members. The reason for that is at the end of the Cold War, Germany became the single biggest investor in Russia, in Russian infrastructure, Russian gas, Russian natural resources, because they saw that as a way of protecting themselves so that 1945 never happened again, when Germany was raped by the Soviet Union. And they weren't going to allow that ever to happen again. So they used money to buy the Russians off. And that's why Germany has been soft for the last 7 years on Russian antics in Ukraine. So we weren't expecting that. We're all completely shocked. And I think we're all struggling very fast to keep up with what's going on. What do the Russians want to achieve? Well, on the face of it, if you take a basic geopolitical argument, they're going to divide Ukraine east and west along the Dnipro River, which goes north and south from Kiev to Dnipro, and all the coastal areas. That's the wealth of Ukraine to the east gone. And to the west is just the agricultural and the IT center. And then you've basically got a Russian-speaking east, a Ukrainian, Hungarian, Romanian, Greek-speaking west. And no real infrastructure as a country. That's a basic geopolitical one. But then Russia's paying the price of sanctions. Russia's paying the price of being a pariah nation. Russia's paying a huge price in lives. I know that because I have a lot of Russian friends who I've worked with in many places around the world. And one of my friends, who's the same age as me, married to a Scottish woman who was in the British Army, living in Kiev with their 2 children. Obviously, his wife came back to Scotland when we were evacuated, and he evacuated Russia. He's a veteran of the Chechen Wars, where he was a young officer fighting in Chechnya, and he's just received his mobilization papers. So Russia is paying a huge price if it's having to mobilize 52-year-old men to go to the front. So what is he going for? I talked about climate change and food security earlier. Yeah? Ukraine and Russia supply 30% of the grain required for the world's bread. So 2.5 billion people rely on Ukraine and Russian bread. So if we're going to sanction Russia, and we're going to say, naughty boy, you've invaded Ukraine, you've got no super yachts, no food, nothing, he's just going to turn around and switch the food off. And 2.5 billion people are going to start to starve. And 2.5 billion people are going to put pressure on the governments for those sanctions to be lifted. So Mr. Putin's gamble is that we can't afford the sanctions as much as he can. Okay? So I recommend, and if you can remember this, there's a document or analysis just being produced by Dr. Ian Ralby, who's an international maritime lawyer, and he writes about this stranglehold on food security and what's going to happen next. So that's the gamble. What are the likely outcomes on the ground? The Russian population is 3 times bigger than the Ukrainian population. Russia has more people that they can throw into the fight. Ukraine has more technology and more technology arriving every day to defeat the Russians. Okay. What are the consequences of this? What is the best thing for the world? The best thing for the world is a rapid Russian victory. Why? Because if the Russians don't win quickly, they're going to start to use alternative means to get what they want. Okay? And we, as the West, cannot afford those alternative means. That's obviously not good for Ukraine. It's not good for any of us either, but it is ultimately, physically, the least worrying scenario. And that's, an analysis I share with a number of people. And if you read The Guardian and you look at Gordon Carrera on the BBC, you'll understand what it is that I'm talking about in terms of our fears now. Okay? So what are we doing about it? Not a lot. Okay. Not a lot we can do. I'll talk about the UK position, and I'll talk about, NATO's position. NATO is not going to fight for Ukraine. If we fight for Ukraine, we will go to war with Russia, and there will be a thermonuclear war very quickly. So we're not going to fight for Ukraine. We are going to provide Ukraine with the means and the method to fight for itself, to defend itself, to defeat Russia. And tens of thousands of people are flocking to Ukraine to join the Ukrainian Foreign Legion. I don't recommend anybody do that. Okay? This is my 12th war. I'm not going back to the war as a soldier. I've done that. And my thorough recommendation to any of you who are thinking of doing something like that is never be in an army at the start of the war, because nobody knows what they're doing and you'll die very quickly. Wait until it's been on for a few months and then go, because they'll have learned what to do. So we're supplying material support, moral support, intellectual support to help the Ukrainians fight against Russia. Okay? Then we're also providing aid. And I'll just give you a snapshot of what I'm doing. I'm going to tell you a couple of personal stories of people in a moment as well. So when our organization left, I was compulsorily evacuated by the UK on an RAF flight 72 hours before the invasion with my daughter. I couldn't go on a commercial flight because I was COVID positive at the time. And so Ingrid and I had a great adventure on a C-17 at 3 o'clock in the morning and -6 to get back. Americans and Canadians and Danes were also evacuated from our mission. We had 1,500 people working there. And then the invasion struck, and the rest of the international staff were evacuated, but our protocols and agreements with Ukraine meant that we were not allowed to take our local staff with us. And in many places, they had to be left behind. And I found that morally bankrupt. So myself and a couple of other people have put together a plan. And if you watch BBC Breakfast Television tomorrow at about 8:30, you'll see Sue Frank on. She's one of my colleagues from Eastern Europe. We are both still employed by the Foreign Office. I was meant to be on this morning, but they cancelled it because she's better looking than me and I'm only good for radio. So we are still employed by the Foreign Office, but we feel that what has happened, it's not the British government that has let us down, it's our organisation, that our staff have been let down. I have 800 members of my team and their families currently on the run in Ukraine. I'm going to tell you a couple of their stories in a moment, plus other friends as well. We had one member of staff killed in Kharkiv very early on, which she stepped out of the shelter to get medicine for her mother and was killed by a shell. So individually, we're trying to help. My mantra now is people out, stuff in. So I've gone to the Regimental Association. We've collected about 500 sets of helmets and stuff from soldiers who left the army many years ago and took all their favourite stuff with them. And I'm meeting them in Stirling tomorrow, and we're taking a truck back in, which is enough to supply a battalion of 500 people shortly, plus medical aid as well. And I'm coordinating medical aid between friends from California with the California Ambulance Services and a Czech NGO in there. And a whole host of other things, just focusing on my team. I can't help everybody in Ukraine. But other little individual efforts. So today, for example, I've linked up with another guy from my regiment. He's on the ground in Kiev, and today we rescued a 52-year-old guy suffering cancer who can't get his treatment anywhere else. How does that work? Why did I say we rescued him? Because the request came in to me. I know him. Some money has exchanged hands, and so we got this guy out. And we're doing that for people in high-risk areas across eastern Ukraine and central Ukraine now, with a team of lunatics who aren't getting paid at this moment. We're just paying for fuel and stuff. But ex-special forces from the United States and the UK and other lunatics that are just there for an adventure. So, questions? Yeah.
When you said you were shocked, like when the war started a couple of weeks ago, what was the moment when you really realised and your brain kind of switched and this isn't going to happen until this has happened?
So I think there's a couple of levels in that. I expected something to happen, okay, and I did not expect the scale of what was going to happen. So I think it was relief that I got out with my daughter. If I'd been there by myself, I would have stayed. But she's only 2 years old, so need to get her out. So there was relief that I'd got out in time. Then there was the moment is when I saw Mr. Putin's speech saying, "Don't you dare get in my way," and that was the moment I realized we were in for something really serious. Because I think Europe, and France and Germany in particular, could have accepted the annexation of Donbass in the east as a compromise war. But when that started, that was it. Does that answer the question? Okay, thanks. Yeah.
Do you think you'll ever personally be back on the ground?
I'll be there next week. Yeah. So the kit that we are collecting tomorrow, the deadline for other stuff to come in is the 17th of March. And then as soon as we've got it all together, we're driving to Ukraine. What does being back on the ground mean? I'm supporting my friends and the country that looked after me for 7 years. So I'll be back and forth. Yeah.
Do you think the media's done well covering?
I think in the early days of the war, because I think a lot of people were kept on the hop, there wasn't a lot of information coming from outside. I have a lot of friends who work. So, for example, one of my best friends is the New York Times correspondent in Ukraine. Known her for 12 years, from Bosnia through to other places. And she's struggling because each of these organizations has its own risk threshold. And so she has a security team that tells her what she can and cannot do. Okay, the editor might be saying, go there and get this story, and the security team is going, no, we're not doing that. So there's a challenge. But I think as the war has developed, I think the BBC coverage is fantastic. They're in Kharkiv, they're in Kiev, and they're doing a really good job. But it's a challenge. This is not like Afghanistan or Iraq, where you're able to negotiate your way through things. This is high-intensity warfare where people are being killed without being seen. Okay, so it is really difficult for the media to operate, and I think they're doing a reasonably good job.
Duncan, can you clarify something for me? People talk a lot about, you've got to stand up to bullies.
Yeah.
Putin's a bully.
Yeah.
How does that play out in diplomatic terms?
Okay. So there's two schools of thought. There's the realists and the liberals or the radicals, in this. I'm a realist. And had we, in 2014, put 500 British soldiers into Kiev in 2014, none of this would be happening. Because we would have drawn a line that said, you're not going to cross this now. Now it's too late. Okay? Mr. Putin relies on the fact that we are not going to do anything. He's done that all over the place. And then when they start moving, he uses overwhelming force to shatter the will of the population. And we saw that in Grozny, we saw that in Aleppo, and we're now seeing that in Mariupol and Kharkiv. And I've got a couple of friends from Mariupol who I'll talk about in a moment. So does that answer the question? I think there isn't a diplomatic way to stand up to a bully. You have to use force or the threat of force.
Okay, so to carry the second part of the question on, what should we do? Follow the bluff?
Well,
Put your forces into the Russian border?
there's a lot of talk of close the sky. Everyone's heard that. close the sky, yeah? So if we close the sky, we will go to war with Russia, and because we will have to shoot a Russian plane down in order to close the sky. What bluff can we call? You know, he has demonstrated that he is not bluffing. He has said clearly that he has put his nuclear forces on alert. He has said clearly that if any of you get in my way, you will suffer consequences of the like you've never suffered in history. And he's not bluffing, because he's not a bluffer. And in my experience with Russian diplomats, they don't bluff. They tell you what they want, and that's it. There isn't much of a negotiation. So we missed the opportunity diplomatically several years ago. And we only have two options now, which is to go to war or surrender. I mean, I watched Munich the other night, Edge of Munich or something like that. I can't remember. It wasn't a very good film, but you know, it was just a reminder of where we are. If we don't do something, if we don't go to war with Russia, Russia will just keep going a little bit further and a little bit further. And we have a choice. We do it now or we wait. Sorry, it's very bleak, but I'm in a bit of a bleak mood right now. Yeah. So I know that the reservists, military reservists, are being called up. Okay, they're not yet into a full general mobilization where it's every 18-year-old is, you know, pick up your gun and go to the front. That takes time to generate. And you know what he's hoping for is to get this out of the way before he has to do that. So I would say at this stage, no. It's just people with technical skills and specialist skills who have seen combat before who are being called up. Yeah.
Ukraine obviously putting up a huge amount of resistance. If Putin did take Ukraine and fulfill his goals, what do you think his plan would be next?
Okay. So I talked about the food. So you can see all the ports are being taken. I think there are 17 ports on the Black Sea coast that Ukraine uses for trade, Odessa being the largest one of those. So it is obvious that there will be a Ukrainian resistance. It is obvious that Ukrainian resistance will be funded and supplied by the West. But once he starts his threat of closing the food down, then what do we do? 2.5 billion people will starve. Or will be on the edge of starvation without their staple. So I broke one of my friends the other night. Julie is from Lviv. She went to a private school in Wales. Her sister is still there. She's doing her second master's degree in parasitic microbiology in Paris, and her dad is a good friend of mine. And she asked me how many days or weeks did I think that this was going to go on for. And I've never lied to Julie. I think this is going to go on for decades. This is going to affect all of you for the rest of your lives. The impact of this. This is an epoch-changing event. Okay? The Second World War was the last one, and this is now your one. And so he's just going to carry on. He's going to strangle the world's food, hope that it'll cause us more pain than he's getting, and then hope that things will normalize for Russia in 50 years' time with this larger country with the Black Sea at the bottom as his southern border. Yeah. Sorry, I'm a bit deaf from booms and bangs. I didn't say they think that's the best thing. I said that's probably the best thing for the world, because if he doesn't get a quick win, he will use some of his alternative weapons to get what he wants. And that's not what anybody wants. And Europe does not want a quick win. They just don't want an apocalyptic scenario. Okay. Yeah.
You mentioned the war will be inevitable sooner or later. The scale might be different, but then if we're not going to act now,
Yeah.
then certain
I missed that last part. It,
There will be a war that's going to affect a lot of people.
yeah.
Obviously, we're trying to fight that, but what else can we do? Are we, like you said, it's going to happen sooner or later. So why shouldn't we act right now?
Yeah. Okay. So war is a balance of risks. Okay. So we don't have the resources, the will, or the mental capacity right now in this country to fight this war. It's pretty much similar. If you go back to 1938 when, we're trying to buy time. So by throwing resources in and supporting to Ukrainians, we are buying time, and Ukrainians are going to die on Ukrainian soil to buy us that time, for us to get ready. I mean, we're not in the days of we can build a Spitfire in a couple of days. The technologies that we use now, I don't even know how long it takes to build a fighter plane anymore. Is it a couple of years to build one? I have no idea. So we need time to be able to get ready. And our army, so the UK's Strategic Defence Review last year decided we were never going to fight a war like this because it was never going to happen. And we're just going to do more things like Afghanistan. And so we don't really have any tanks left or anything like that. So this is a huge shift in the way that the world was thinking. Okay. Does that answer your question? Okay, cool. Thank you.
Do you think our freedom of movement around Europe will be affected soon or
I think your cost is going to go up because there's not, there's 7 million people about to hit accommodation all over Europe, but I don't think your freedom of movement is going to suffer. And certainly COVID probably had more impact on that than this is going to have. Okay. One at the back.
Do you think NATO doesn't have responsibility for this war?
So I think there are miscalculations. NATO has made miscalculations. And I go back to what I was talking about at the beginning, that we failed to read Russia. And we failed to have an effective dialogue. And in that dialogue, we didn't listen to Russia's security concerns. Okay? So I think it is possible that we could have done better 10 years ago to address some of these issues. And there's also this march where we assume that a liberal democracy on our models is the best model, when perhaps it might not be appropriate for every culture and nation. And there are different models of ways to work without conflict from around the world. So I worked in Iraq as well for a couple of years, and it's not really a democracy. It's not quite a dictatorship either, something in between, country functions. So I think perhaps we miscalculated the essence of what Russia felt about its identity and the threats to its identity. But I don't think that NATO bears a responsibility for a war of choice by Mr. Putin. Yeah.
Do you have personally have any diplomatic immunity on the country Ukraine, or do you fear the average Ukrainian will be fearing?
Me, if I go back, no, I'm fine. I'm going to be sacked shortly for talking to the media and for talking to you guys. And I won't have a job and I won't have my diplomatic immunity. But I think it's more important to get this message out. Yeah.
You said UK thought this war is inevitability. What's your best guess of when that actual moment will come for us? And also, what do you think that will look like for us? Is it enlistment or what sort of?
No. So when is a good question. It's I don't think that we're deliberately going to do something. I think that we're accidentally going to get dragged in. So it's impossible to pin a date on. Are you going to be mobilized? No. The training bill for a modern infantry soldier is so high that we're not going to be able to train people in the length of time that's necessary to get people out. And we don't do mobilization anymore. We use technology. We use standoff weapons. So I don't think you need to worry about conscription. I mean, national mobilization means other things as well, like, you know, going working in the fields, in the mines, whatever. But I don't think we're going to go anywhere like that. Okay. Yeah. What is money? I mean, if we just look at, you know, what happened during the pandemic, in order to keep things going, people just printed money. You know, Russia's got the largest gold reserves in the world, and it has friends. It does have people that have abstained, and it's quite possible that China is underwriting the Russian economic or currency situation. It is quite possible. You know, I'm not going to say it is, because I don't know. But there are other countries. South Africa also abstained. So I don't think Russia's going to run out of money. And certainly once it starts to own 2.5 billion people's bread, it's definitely going to have money. It's going to run out of tanks very soon, though, because we're killing them very quickly.
Donald Trump seems to claim that he's the president won't happen. Will you be able to agree with him, or do you think he's talk about rubbish?
Donald Trump makes a lot of claims. Let's go. Next. Yeah.
I think you mentioned how you try to sort of plan or predict how Putin would go about the invasion and how he would achieve his targets.
Yeah.
So why didn't he do it the way that he did?
Well, there are different outcomes. In any intelligence scenario, you're looking at what might happen, what is most likely to happen, what the worst thing that could happen could be. And so the worst thing that could have happened was what he did. But we didn't believe that he was going to do that. We felt he was more rational. We felt that he could achieve his aims by sitting outside and just using a long-distance screwdriver to screw everybody. But, you know, that's it. So what he did surprised us. But it was one of the options on the table that we were looking at.
Was the British government given advice that it ignored from you? Or is
No comment. I can't comment on that. No, I mean, I think the British government had the very best advice that it could, and it acted on that, and the evidence of that was the fact that they pulled all of us out a week before everything happened, and they, you know, were clear, along with the Americans, that this is going to happen. So I think the British government listened to what it was told, and it acted. And the fact that it got its anti-tank missiles into Ukraine so quickly showed, you know, how closely they were listening to what was happening. Yes? Oh, okay, Doomsday Scenarios. It's interesting. Who's watched Death of Stalin? Film Death of Stalin. Thoroughly recommend that film as well. Great British comedy. And it gives you an idea of how power is transitioned in Russia. So have a watch of that, and I think he would be replaced quite quickly, but I don't think that whoever replaced him would be of similar character or strength, and then that could cause weakness in Russia, which perhaps we wouldn't want either, because a Russian civil war would look horrible. There was somebody waving a hand at the back on that side a moment ago. No. Okay. Guys, thank you very much for your time. I really appreciate it. And I'm happy to stay behind to ask one-on-one questions or answer one-on-one questions. And particularly those of you that are from Lviv, Odessa, or other places, because I know there are some of you here. What can we do to help your families? Okay.